All right, Rachel, welcome to Impossible Trade-offs. We're really happy to have you.
Thank you so much for having me.
So I thought if we could start, could you share a little bit about what the Bipartisan Policy Center is, the work that you do there? In full disclosure for everybody, I was a fellow on Rachel's team starting in April of 21 until I started at Duco here in January. So we've had a lot of chance to work together, but for those that aren't familiar, I think a little primer could be helpful.
Absolutely. So the Bipartisan Policy Center, commonly known as BPC, we're a DC-based think tank that works across a number of different issue areas, everything from immigration to infrastructure to economic policy. I manage our elections project, which is one piece of our broader democracy program that focuses specifically on election administration policy, looking at how we can create durable bipartisan policy solutions informed by election officials to create secure, accessible, and trustworthy elections. I've been at BPC for about 4 years now. I joined in 2019, when elections looked a little differently than they do today. But so it's been a learning process and loved the chance to work with you, and I'm excited for this conversation.
Yeah, I'm really excited for this conversation too because you and I are a little bit both data geeks and election geeks. So we there was a survey that we did in 2022 trying to look at where people not only where people turn to for election related information, but what messengers are the ones that matter the most to them or that they listen to. And we decided to recreate that here going into 2024. Can you share a bit more about the survey? We did this in conjunction with States United and the Integrity Institute. Share a little bit more about the survey and why you wanted to do it and some of the questions that we asked.
Yeah, absolutely. So, as I mentioned, one of our biggest stakeholders at the Elections Project are election officials. And since the 2020 election, there's been increasing pressure being put on this group of folks, these public servants that are routinely underfunded and overwhelmed. And as public doubt in elections has grown, there's all this pressure on them to solve the problem, which, in my opinion, is not theirs to solve. So I wanted to dive a little bit more deeply into what Americans information environment actually looks like. Where are they going for election information? What sources do they trust? What platforms do they use? Who do they think should be responsible for false or deceptive elections content? And that was what the survey really got into. So, like you mentioned, in 2022, we administered a similar smaller scale survey thanks to some funding from the MIT Election Data and Science Lab. And then we administered it again in December of 2023. We did it in conjunction with Morning Consult, and it's a nationally representative survey, really getting into the weeds on information sources and opinions about elections.
And what were some of the findings that you found most interesting with the survey?
So there were a bunch of really interesting findings. I highly encourage, if anyone hasn't read it yet, go ahead and search. It's called Who Voters Trust for Election Information in 2024 on BPC's website. But there were kind of three really important findings that I'd love to discuss with you. So the first was that election officials face an uphill battle when breaking into a crowded media environment. So to help understand what the information environment looks like, we asked what sources. So think of the channels of information like television, social media, or search engines, and what people or groups like news media professionals, candidates, and election officials that Americans look to for information about elections. When it comes to the sources, those channels of information, Americans most often learn about elections from television and social media. And when it comes to the individuals or groups that they learn from on those channels, adults look most often to news media professionals, commentators, and candidates. Notably, just 18% of Americans said that they would look to their local or county election administrators for information about elections. This puts election officials fifth behind news media professionals, commentators, candidates, and fact-checking organizations. This is where we see the most notable decline from our 2022 survey, in which state and local election officials were ranked top for sources of election information alongside search engines. Now, it would be easy to say that this change means that trust in elections has fallen. Trust in election officials, rather, has fallen. I want to be very clear that that is not the case. In 2022, we asked adults who they look to for information about how elections are run and how to register and vote. So really those kind of nuts and bolts of voting in elections. This time, the frame was a little bit broader. we asked just about where Americans would look for information about elections, period. And so I believe this paints a truer picture of Americans' information behaviors, because while it makes sense that Americans might say that they'll look to their election official for how to register to vote or where their polling place is, that is only one small part of the broader information ecosystem. So the bottom line is that while the public looks to election officials for the nitty gritty voting and elections processes, they look to the media and political elites to learn about elections at large. So while election officials are the best source for authoritative election information, it's unreasonable and frankly ineffective to expect them to single-handedly educate the American public about election processes overall. They can't do it alone. We need these other stakeholders like media and commentators and candidates to help share these messages to build confidence.
And I'll put the link in the show notes as well for anybody that wants to find it. And this takes me to one of my favorite stats that I think is really important when we look at trust in just frankly the electoral process, how votes are counted, how the results are communicated. There's a lot of different parts of an election that an official works on that we'll get to here in a second. But that finding that most people trust how their own vote will be counted, but they don't necessarily trust how it's going to be counted. Other people's votes are going to be counted elsewhere around the United States. And I think that that means that, again, to the point, an election official can be responsible for their community, the jurisdiction that they have, but they can't necessarily be responsible for helping people to understand that across the board. What did you sort of take away from that?
Yeah, it's really interesting. So we asked the American public their confidence that their votes would be counted accurately in the 2024 presidential election at 4 different levels that are kind of common levels asked in most surveys about election outcomes. So the first was whether they thought their vote would be counted accurately, whether they thought votes in their community would be counted accurately, votes in their state, and votes across the country. It's very common in election science research that we see the levels of trust fall the further away we get from home. And this is what we found in our 2022 survey as well. Confidence was highest in the personal vote count and votes in their community, and it then tapered off. What was interesting about this survey, and I haven't fully wrapped my head around why this might be yet, but we actually saw confidence in one's own vote being counted fall. It fell by 7 percentage points. So 76% of Americans were confident that their vote would be counted accurately in the midterm election. That fell to 69% being confident that their vote would be counted accurately in the presidential election this year. So now we saw that confidence was highest that votes in one's own community would be counted accurately. And again, this is something we see frequently. And I think there are a number of different reasons that could be the case. I think people are more trustworthy of their neighbors. They might know their own local election official. They might be more familiar with those processes. And that's where it becomes difficult to try and cultivate confidence in both the national level when procedures and operations do vary across the United States. And I was just talking with some election officials recently, and they were recounting on how election officials might be hurting themselves a little bit because they're so rooted in trying to be 100% accurate all the time that when a voter asks, well, I know you have an accurate process, but what are they doing over there in Arizona? An election official might say something like, well, I don't know what they're doing in Arizona, but I know what we're doing here. And they're saying that because they really just don't know what Arizona is doing. They can't be experts on all 50 states and thousands and thousands of jurisdictions election processes. So it ends up coming across as if other states or other jurisdictions are less trustworthy than one's own. But what we know to be the case is that there are these shared security practices that almost all states actually do have in common. Depending on when this airs, BPC is working with Issue One and R Street to put out an infographic laying out the security practices that every single state has in common. Because while there are some policy differences across states, we know that the very nuts and bolts of making sure that voting machines are accurate, verifying results, making sure that only eligible voters are able to cast a ballot and cast it once, those are all things that every single jurisdiction in the United States does.
When do you know when you all are putting that out?
It should be next week, so the week of the 18th.
Oh, great. This will be airing on Thursday. So for everybody who just heard that, assuming that it's out by then, I'll put it in the show notes. If not, keep an eye out on the Anchor Change newsletter and we'll make sure that we get you that link no matter what. Now, another thing that we wanted to look at in this survey and why we had the partnership with the Integrity Institute as well. So I was wearing a couple different hats on this survey. Was we also wanted to get a sense of how people felt about how social media companies, the government, and others were keeping people safe online and who they thought should have some of that responsibility. Can you dig into some of those findings as well?
Absolutely. So we looked at Americans' experiences on social media in a couple different ways. One point I want to make that I thought was interesting was that people actually have positive experiences about elections on social media, and I think that often gets lost.
What?
I
That
know,
that can
right?
happen? That can happen? And
Crazy.
what?
But we had huge numbers. I can pull up the stats specifically, but who reported that, they often have positive experiences encountering information they weren't aware of before. They find community. There are positive applications of social media when it comes to elections and politics that we often overlook because it's so much, easier and more newsworthy to focus on all the negative aspects. But that said, we do know that there are risks posed by supercharged misinformation this year. And so we asked a little bit about what the public thinks, who the public thinks should be responsible for addressing false or deceptive election content. And the finding that I thought was most interesting here was that a plurality, so the option that received the highest share of selections but less than a majority, a plurality of Americans think that government and social media companies should work in tandem to address false or deceptive election content. I think this is particularly revealing when we have continuing litigation with Murphy v. Missouri concerning executive branch outreach to social media companies that, as we put out in a blog together, can actually have a chilling effect, not only on the agencies and individuals that are impacted by that litigation, but on all government officials who become worried that working with social media companies to flag or address false or deceptive election content could land them in lengthy litigation that hurts their ability to serve their voters. So that was one area where it seems like a big part of the American public thinks social media companies and government should be doing more together to address this issue.
I was particularly happy to see that because I've long thought that in terms of regulation and stuff, we're going to need to set checks and balances because nobody likes social media companies being solely in charge. Nobody likes the government being solely in charge, and so that's why I think you see this combination of the two. Um, but also we asked about the topic du jour of right now, which is AI. And we see a lot of headlines of everybody being like, oh my God, AI is gonna destroy the world. We're gonna be awash in misinformation. There's a lot of concern out there, and this is why I encourage everybody to panic responsibly again around it. But we also asked about if people will turn to chatbots for this, and what did we find?
So we found that just 2% of Americans said that they would look to AI-enabled chatbots as a source of election information. Remarkably, this option ranked below any other information source, including don't know or no opinion, which if you look at a lot of survey results is usually the very bottom number, but AI actually ranked below that. So I think that's a little bit comforting because it shows that the American public has at least some degree of AI literacy. They know that AI is not necessarily going to be the most accurate source. So they shouldn't be going and opening up ChatGPT, for example, and asking how to vote or how elections are run. That said, I don't think it's quite as simple as saying, well, only 2% of voters said they would look to the source, therefore it's not a problem. We know that AI can be embedded into other sources through API use. And so I've been reading recently a recent study of how 5 leading AI models responded to election-related inquiries, and they found wide variance between different models' accuracy, completeness, bias, and harm levels. And what I found was most interesting was that this tension between API use, so kind of like external embedded use of generative AI tools, and then native use on those platforms. And so though APIs are often used to benchmark performance of AI models, and we know usage policies are typically a little bit more lax when it comes to the use of APIs, After the study was released, the spokesperson for Meta said the results were rendered meaningless because the study used APIs. And Meta said, users would ask these questions within the platform itself. But I think our survey indicates that that's not the case. The public is unlikely to go onto ChatGPT or go onto Llama and kind of type in inquiries. They might be more likely to interact with generative AI content or integrated chatbots through a platform that they trust more. And that might not always be disclosed that those are AI generated. We know that a lot of the big platforms have usage policies that would require disclosure, but we know that enforcement is still being ramped up, and we don't quite know how well those usage policies are going to be enforced. So when it comes to AI tools and elections, we have to make sure that we're applying those usage policies both on the tools themselves, on APIs, and making sure that the public knows when they're interacting with AI content, because that study, that proof did find that there was pretty wide varieties in accuracy, and very often the tools were producing answers that weren't 100% accurate.
Yeah, and I think too that it's also important to remember that to your point, people are going to be using, like, now if you search in Google, you might have a generated AI summary before you see the links. And a lot of these platforms have announced partnerships with folks like Democracy Works or the National Association of Secretaries of States or other official bodies to help people get this information, but they are still also incorporating this information into them. So we're in this in between state that in my ideal world, we would have been planning this out much earlier, but we are where we are now. And I think this will change a lot. Like, I'll be very curious if we were to be able to do this again in the fall, like how much this could change. But I do think that, at the moment, people just aren't as used to yet of being able to go to chatbots to look for this information and kind of think about it. So per usual of everything, there's a lot of nuance to this situation. Before we move on, are there any other points on the survey that you wanted to make sure people knew about or were thinking about before we kind of move to your work more broadly?
No, I think that was all the main points. I will say, I think it's back on the AI point. I really applaud, OpenAI for being a little bit more conservative, along with a lot of the other major AI developers, and trying to maybe not have too many election-related answers this year. But I do think, kind of like to your point, AI is ultimately going to be integrated into search and into all of the products that we use. And so I see a lot of folks within the election ecosystem putting down kind of any use of AI when it comes to election information. And I worry that is going to kneecap us in the future and keep us from being able to innovate and meet voters where they are with modern, accessible information. So to your point about thinking ahead, I would want us to think beyond the 2024 election, to think about what does the information environment look like in 2026 or 2028, and how can we start preparing for that now?
Yeah, I 100% agree with that. And I think that, this stuff is not just over after this election cycle. And there's actually a lot of I'm kind of excited about the different ways that we might think about AI being incorporated into this type of work, and also how we think about mitigating some of those concerns and all of that. But let's shift over. I want to shift over to your work on elections in general, because there's a lot of really interesting stuff here. Because prior to 2020, most people were like, they probably knew about primaries. They knew about registering to vote and there'd be deadlines. They knew they went and voted on either election day or they did absentee, maybe early ballot. But very few never ever needed to know what happened between election day and somebody declaring who the winner was and inauguration. And there's actually a ton of steps in between, and there's a ton of complexity to our electoral system overall. So before we dig into some of that complexity and everything, could you just share a little bit more about overall on elections, the types of things that your team is focused on and really trying to dig into to help people understand?
Absolutely. So I mentioned already that we work primarily with election officials, so the individuals who are responsible for running our elections at the state and local level. We work with them to create durable bipartisan policy solutions. In 2019, we formed a group we call our Task Force on Elections. That's a group of about 30 state and local election administrators, who we work with almost as a sounding board for all of our policy recommendations. It was created based on the idea that election officials are very often ignored when state legislators or federal legislators are having conversations about the policies that impact election administration. And that leaving them out of the process, the folks who know best how elections are run on the ground, creates bad policy solutions. We very often have deadlines that don't match up. That end up creating longer waits for results. They create waits for voters at polling places. And they just in general make our elections less effective than they could be. And so we work with this group to really funnel election administrators' opinions into the policymaking process. We've released a number of reports with recommendations with this group over the last 5 years on everything from election audits to electronic ballot transmission to pre-processing. And we also work with state and federal legislators to try and get those recommendations enacted. Because it's one thing to write a report and put it on our website. It's another thing to make those policies reality. And then I think in 2024, we're shifting focus a little bit. Actually, it's something you said once, Katie, that has been continually inspiring me about having different seasons of work depending on the election season. So we spent most of the last year or two really focusing on generating content. And this year we're going to be a little bit more nimble, trying to use this group of election administrators to weigh in more quickly and offer expert insight on the issues that we know will come up as elections are being run. I will also say we also have a big focus on the election workforce this year. So we formed another election workforce advisory council, again, about 30 experts, this time a little bit more interdisciplinary, including election officials and public administration experts, experts in adult learning, trying to look at this issue of recruitment, retention, and training in election administration, because there's all this talk of turnover and how it's going to, there's droves of election officials leaving and it's going to create problems in 2024. We wanted to investigate whether that's actually the case. And if so, what mitigations can be adopted to address it?
So before we even dig in even more, I want to zoom out a little bit because as you were talking, I was like, oh, we have, I've got people outside of America that listen to this podcast. But then I was like, wait a second, even most Americans might not realize how many election officials there are in America because most countries, there is a national level election commission. And we do have one here in the US, the FEC, but that's very focused on campaign finance and keeping track of donations and those types of laws. They're not involved in the administration of the election like other election commissions around the globe are. So can you give everybody just a really quick 101 primer of why there are so many election officials around the country?
Yeah, so there are about 10,000 election officials, depending on how you count, right? You have municipalities, you have counties, but by and large, there are 10,000 election jurisdictions, so kind of localities where elections are being run in the United States. Elections are primarily administered at the state and local level. And this goes back to the founding of our country. We wanted to have that decentralization and to have states primarily responsible for administering their own elections. That does create a challenge today when we have 50 states and often even locals running their elections a little bit differently. So like I said earlier, we have those kind of core security competencies that every jurisdiction shares. But when it comes down to things like when ballots are sent to voters, or if mail voting is even allowed, well, when the voter registration deadline is, how long it takes to process results. All of these things vary because of that kind of decentralized rulemaking. And that creates a challenge when it comes to communicating with the American public about elections. It's very difficult to have one single message about why elections should be trustworthy when the processes around elections vary. And so that's just kind of a constant challenge we face, but it's also a strength because we don't have like one central authority where all elections are being run. It almost protects us a little bit against, either cyber attacks on election infrastructure, or kind of like any kind of coordinated subversion campaigns are more difficult when you have all of these different points of contact rather than one big one that can be targeted.
That makes sense. Well, it makes sense to me, but I know of many others. And to all my tech friends who are listening, who are like, "Oh, we'll just get a list of all the election dates or all the candidates or all the processes." This is why it's so complicated, is because there are this many election officials that you have to find it, go through and find this information. And let me tell you, most of it is not in machine readable format. So it's not like there's just an API that you can click into. Someday, if I had all the money and there were no laws or anything against this, I would put money into standardizing election data
Mm.
around this country. Would be an amazing thing if I could wave that magic wand. But let's go back into a little bit on detail, kind of also in this online space of how you have been working with election officials at the Bipartisan Policy Center, because I think one of the unique things that you all are able to do is do some of these convenings and bringing together of these election officials and tech companies and civil society and others. And so, can you dig into some of the projects that you've been doing in that space?
Absolutely. So we have a couple of different initiatives going on here, but one I'll talk about is our threat ideation work. So over the coming months, BPC will convene election administrators, civic leaders, tech company representatives, and other experts in key swing states to participate in tabletop exercises that are focused on novel technological threats to American democracy. So these exercises are ultimately intended to strengthen the relationships and pathways of communication between stakeholders in advance of what some observers are calling the first AI election. And we think that despite the fact that there's going to be more potential for cheap and scalable misinformation this year, tech companies may be less well equipped to handle online threats than they were in 2020 because of the deteriorating relationships between tech companies and government officials, as well as many tech companies having dialed back their civic integrity efforts in laying off members of their trust and safety teams. So these exercises are aiming to improve the ability of election officials and tech company representatives to work together to respond to potential crises. We're hoping to develop a sense of understanding of the responsibilities, strengths, and limitations of other election stakeholders. Like you mentioned, right, a tech company probably isn't going to be able to go online and find one source of all of the different things that they would want for an election. Though, if you didn't listen to your last podcast with Lewis from Democracy Works, highly recommend it. They're working on that. It's like having that understanding, right? We're never going to be able to bring 10,000 election officials together with every single tech company representative. But what we can do is create these kind of pockets of understanding within the companies so that they're able to better appreciate what election officials are facing when it comes to election day, understanding that an election office with less than one full-time staff person and the weeks trying to administer early voting in the weeks before an election probably isn't going to be able to respond quickly if there's some emerging misinformation. And so even just understanding those very basic matters of what they have on their plate is one motivation for our threat ideation work.
Um, that's great. And we did something like this in 2022 when I was at BPC as well, at more of a national level. And so I will also put that in the show notes because we did some lessons learned from that. But I think the biggest thing for me was just getting the folks in the room so they could talk to one another and understand what it was like being in each of their shoes and what everyone was doing. Because again, everyone's got is so busy in trying to do this. If even just opening up those lines of communication is really important. Um,
Can I
and
say,
can yeah, go ahead.
yeah, I think that the other interesting part, right, is we've seen, like, I will be the first to admit that we're not the first group to be doing threat ideation work on AI and tech, right? Lots of other groups have done it and they've had amazing results. But when working with election offices specifically, I find it very easy to get swept up in these hypothetical, catastrophic scenarios when it comes to AI and elections. And increasingly, we see election officials trying to respond to that by doing all this threat ideation work themselves. They feel like it's on their shoulders to try and game out every potential consequence of AI or tech when it comes to the 2024 election. But generally speaking, what we know to be the case is that there are a couple likely threats to election administration that we know already exist and we already have solutions to, right? So there's one, the cheaper, faster more targeted and more scalable misinformation. There's also the more sophisticated cyber threats to election offices, including cyber attacks on election infrastructure, phishing operations, impersonation of election officials. So we see in these two primary categories, these are things that election offices have already been working to respond to. Cyber threats in particular since 2016, misinformation in particular since 2020. So we see generative AI exacerbating these threats, making clear that election offices shouldn't be taking it upon themselves to try and game out every single potential scenario. Instead, we're encouraging them to focus on creating and testing incident response plans to the threats that we already know exist with solutions that we already have. And so one goal of our tabletop exercise is to do some of that, more hypothetical work for them. So we're able to create lessons that all election offices can adopt to improve their operations going into 2024.
That makes a lot of sense. And I going beyond just the online stuff around that, the other thing that we were talking about earlier is that election officials have a lot of jobs beyond just counting votes. There is a lot that goes into running elections generally. Can you dig into that as well? So that kind of like break that out for people of what that looks like and why that might make it challenging for some of these election officials.
Yeah, so the elections that receive the most attention, right, are our kind of federal general elections, the midterms, and the presidential in November of even numbered years. And so because those are the elections that receive the most attention, there's this misconception among the general public that election officials only work for 1 or 2 days a year trying to administer those big elections. What we know is that that's absolutely not the case, and that misconception often results in inadequate funding for election offices, and policymakers think that it's kind of a here or there job. But what it really is, it's a year-round endeavor. Not only are election officials responsible for counting and processing ballots, they have to work with campaigns and candidates to get those ballots created. They have to proof the ballots. They have to make sure they meet all of the state and federal requirements for ballots. They have to start sending them out to uniformed and overseas voters 45 days before an election. More and more states are doing mail and early voting. And again, that happens, the preparation for that starts going into effect months before an election. Voter registration takes place often year-round, kind of depending on the unique situations in each state. There's also kind of continual list maintenance, making sure that the list of voters that election officials are using is accurate. That all takes place year-round. And then there's all of the prep that goes into running this huge logistical operation, identifying polling places, making sure that voters know where their polling places are. It's really a massive effort. And increasingly, we see this becoming a highly complex endeavor because of the threats to election infrastructure we saw particularly during and after 2016. Election officials are now responsible for maintaining the security of their voting systems and online presence. After the misinformation increases we saw in recent years, they're also trying to have these huge public communications campaigns and interact with media. And so the skill set required for this role is getting increasingly complex, when many members of the public still see it as a primarily clerical or administrative position.
And go into how much do you think voters actually need to know about all of this nuance? Like I mean, that can feel very overwhelming now if I'm like, oh man, this feels like a lot. I don't have a lot of time. Like, how do you think people should think about this and finding that balance?
Yeah, so after 2020, I heard a lot of people say that the solution to all of this is voter education. And I actually think that's a little misguided. I don't think that voters should have to understand the nuances of ballot tabulation to have trust in election outcomes. From my perspective, that wasn't what changed in 2020 that led to decreases in voter confidence. We know from research that voters' confidence in election outcomes is primarily influenced by two factors. One is voters' own experience casting their ballot. And that's kind of part of why what we talked about earlier, voters' confidence is higher in their own personal and their community vote counts. And then it's also messaging from political elites. And so that's what we found in our survey, right? Voters are hearing about elections from this variety of sources. So to say that voter education about things like audits and the security of voting machines is going to rebuild confidence, I think is misguided because, I've been working in this field for like coming up on 5 years now, and I still don't fully understand all of these complex operations. And so I think to expect the American public to be able to see all of the nuance and complexity of the election system and then be able to determine for themselves that it is secure and accurate, it's not going to work. And so I think there are a couple of ways that we can get at this, right? I think one is trying to get those other messengers, those political elites, those media professionals, to do more to share confidence building messages about elections. I think there's more research that needs to be done in terms of what messages really resonate with the American public. And then I've been a little kind of skeptical about election officials' ability to reach the American public at large, but I do think there are steps they can take to make sure that their messages are resonating with their voters and making sure that they're available so that when the media wants to cover an election, they know where to look and that information is easy and readily available. One example I think is really admirable is Bay Area Vote. So it's this coalition of election offices in the Bay Area in California, and they banded together to pool resources and create simple messages that will resonate with their voters. They're actually working with a communications firm to kind of take it to the next level. And so one example I want to give is there's this process called canvassing. It's kind of what election officials do after the election to make sure that all of the kind of ballots and election processes operated as intended. When election officials talk about this, they often very quickly get into the nitty gritty of like the percent of ballots that are audited. They get into the weeds on the technology, but Bay Area Votes created a fact sheet on the official canvas, and it only has 4 bullet points. It says that during the canvas, election officials, 1, count every eligible ballot; 2, ensure votes are only counted once; 3, confirm proper procedures were followed; and 4, verify the voting system is properly counting ballots. Those are the kind of 4 things that voters really have questions about, and being able to respond in a way that makes sense without trying to explain all the complexity of like every single deadline after an election, I think is going to be more effective in the long term.
Amazing. And yeah, I think that this is really important to just reiterate what you said. This really is sort of, I mean, it's, you hear it a lot, but a whole of society approach of helping people to build the trust up in how elections are conducted and helping people to know that like what the outcome is one that has been done in a free and fair way. And so Rachel, thank you so much for joining us. Really appreciate it. And I will put links to all of BPC's work on this and the specific things we mentioned in all the show notes. But thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Katie. It was a pleasure.